Pues ya estamos aquí de nuevo. Muchas gracias por seguir ahí. Entiendo que los que están aquí saben perfectamente quién es Eva, así que me van a permitir que no haga una presentación al uso de aquellas que podemos encontrar en Google o en la Wikipedia con todos sus títulos, sus méritos, sus honores, porque, bueno, viendo charlas anteriores de Eva, sé que a ella eso no le suele interesar y porque sobre todo le quitaría tiempo a ella, que es a quien venimos a escuchar. Eva, es un honor tenerte aquí en esta sesión de inauguración del Festival de las Ideas en su primera edición. Muchísimas gracias por venir. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Sí que recordaré, por si hay algún, bueno, para dar la bienvenida, los modales al fin y al cabo sí son importantes. Sí que recordaré que esta socióloga, máster en comunicaciones y doctorada en comunicación, que ha impartido clases en universidades y escuelas de las más prestigiosas del mundo, fue elegida en 2009 por su búsqueda del alma del capitalismo por el periódico alemán Die Zeit como uno de los 12 pensadoras que probablemente cambien el pensamiento del futuro. Y está aquí hoy porque, entre otras cosas, su campo de intervención, de análisis, de actuación es tan amplio que la han convertido en una de las grandes pensadoras sobre la teoría de las emociones, su uso, su mercantilización, el significado moral de la modernidad, la teoría crítica aplicada al arte y a la cultura popular, el capitalismo afectivo y emocional, y cómo son de complicadas las sinergias del sistema, cómo los discursos emocionales determinan los políticos, sociales y económicos, y al contrario. Ella ha escrito mucho, ha trabajado mucho, es traducida a múltiples idiomas, entre otros el nuestro. Gran parte de sus libros están publicados en la editorial Katz y este es su último trabajo y es sobre el que va a versar principalmente esta conversación. Les leo el título: La vida emocional del populismo, cómo el miedo, el asco, el resentimiento y el amor socavan la democracia. Vamos a empezar ya con nuestra conversación, Eva. Te quería preguntar antes que nada, antes de entrar en los detalles de este último libro tuyo, ¿en qué momento y por qué decides dedicar tu esfuerzo, tu capacidad de análisis a investigar las emociones, que es algo tan cotidiano que todos creemos que las podemos entender, pero son tan complejas que, como tú misma dices, tienen el poder de negar la evidencia empírica, de negar los datos, de negar los hechos? Entonces, no sé, parecen aguas muy turbulentas para un analista.
I don't understand you.
Eva no tiene la traducción, ¿sí?
No.
Déjame unos instantes, vamos a comprobar si Eva tiene. So I was speaking and you doesn't understand me. Nothing. It was a wonderful presentation.
I'm so sorry.
No.
Oh, no.
Then I repeat for you.
Now I hear you.
Yeah. Okay. So I was presenting you and. You are amazing, and bueno, vamos a empezar ya con la conversación, Eva, porque tenemos mucho tiempo que aprovechar. Mi primera pregunta era sobre por qué te interesas, por qué trabajas tanto en analizar las emociones, que es algo que tú misma dices, que son tan complejas, que tienen el poder de negar toda evidencia empírica, de negar los datos, de negar los hechos. A mí me parece un terreno complicado para una analista.
So let me say something about sociology and emotions. Emotions are thought to be individual, private, universal, and in fact sociology very much likes to go into those areas that are thought to be very individual and show how social they are. So if you think about Emile Durkheim, the founder of sociology, the French founder, he wrote a book in 1897 called Suicide, and he wanted to understand the phenomenon of suicide. And instead of viewing it as an individual pathology, as many people would today, maybe they would think somebody was so depressed that they committed suicide. So Durkheim did something radical. He said that suicide was actually very much connected to your social group, whether you were married or not, whether you were a Jew or a Protestant, and so on and so forth. That is, for me, the founding gesture of sociology, taking something that looks psychological and show how sociological it is, that it is actually determined by norms and so on and so forth. He did not address emotions proper, but in a way it was the logical evolution of sociology to move to the field of emotions, which were thought to be the realm of psychology. And there has always been, if you want, a struggle between psychology and sociology. So what does it mean for sociologists to study emotions? I'm just going to give you a few examples of what it means. So we remember this picture of the Syrian toddler on the beach of Bodrum in Turkey. And this picture elicited compassion or indignation or a mixture of both in many, many, many quarters of the world, in many places, very different countries. It elicited the same emotional reaction. So that means, if you want, that we share a cultural grammar of emotions. We will react in the same way quite often to certain objects. That already shows that there is something collective and social to it. A second way in which emotions are very much relevant to sociology and history, sociology is historical, is to show that emotions change with history. Compassion, for example, since we are talking about compassion, compassion is usually thought to really have emerged as a major cultural code, a major moral code in the 18th century. It is likely that, you know, if you had shown this picture to somebody from the Middle Ages, he would not have been as moved as we have been. So that's a second way in which we are, emotions are relevant to sociology. Or if I wanted to give another example, if you offended somebody in a pre-modern society, and this person was an aristocrat, the adequate response to that would be a duel, would be to provoke the person in duel to repair the offense. If somebody offended you today and you provoke them in duel, you would be good for a psychiatric ward. So it's very, of course, different. If you offend someone and this someone is a woman, she's quite likely to repress her anger because women are trained to repress their anger and not to show it. If you're a young and strong man, you are likely to punch that person in the face. And if you're a Christian, you are likely maybe to give the other cheek. So that shows to you thus that emotions very much depend on the situation. They depend on the social identity of the person who is involved in the situation and of the moral codes you own. And then a third example is that emotions also have an immense social impact. So you remember the Tunisian street vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi. He was a small street vendor, and the police women asked from him a bribe that he did not want to pay. She slapped him in the face. He was extremely offended. He went to the authorities. The authorities did not justify him, and they took the side of the police women. He set himself on fire. And after he set himself on fire, the story was picked up by Al Jazeera, and this is presumably one of the things that provoked the Arab Spring all over many Arab countries. In Tunisia, in Syria, in Egypt, these were the famous Tahrir Square demonstrations. So you see how much emotions, again, have a collective character and have a social and political impact. And so the way I studied this, me personally, in the context of the malaise of democracy that many people are experiencing, is like this, and I will be very short. Let's say, most all of us have a social experience. Let's say you are experiencing downward mobility. Now, downward mobility is a term that sociologists use. I don't expect normal people to use or to tell themselves, oh, I'm experiencing downward mobility. But what you are experiencing is that it's more difficult for your children to go to college. You find it more difficult to buy a house. You find it more difficult to pay your mortgage, and that everything is more expensive. That's a malaise. Now, it's a social experience that maybe has no name. What happens then in politics, in the political arena, is that somebody is going to craft a narrative around this experience. It is going to give it a name, it is going to give it a cause, it is going to give it a story, and it is going to hang around an emotional peg. So you can say the big corporations are filling their pockets while you're working very hard. That's one narrative. Or you can say, well, immigrants are actually making you poorer because they're plundering the state's resources. These are very different narratives to account for your malaise. And one will play maybe on anger and a sentiment of injustice. The other one will play on resentment. So reality, social reality, becomes meaningful to us through these narratives and through the emotions around which they are organized. And that is the ways in which I was interested in studying populism, precisely as a way to organize different types of emotions around different types of narratives.
Quería preguntarles, ¿están ustedes escuchando la traducción? ¿No escuchan la traducción? Bien, ¿podemos hacer algo para que todo el mundo pueda entender lo que Eva Illouz está respondiendo a mis preguntas? ¿Queréis que me detenga? ¿Queréis que siga? Sí, vale. Continuamos. Muchísimas gracias por su atención, de verdad, y muchísimas gracias por su paciencia. Continuamos.
Lara, there are headphones available, and everybody should get headphones. This is what I'm told.
Sí. Es verdad, me recuerda Eva que hay auriculares disponibles para todo aquel que los quiera. No, es que Eva, parece que hay algún problema técnico. There is some technical problem, so but we will continue now. So
whatever you say,
we're going to continue. Pero lamentamos lo que está ocurriendo, de verdad. Eva, hablamos de la vida pública democrática, que está cargada de emociones. La política está cargada de estructuras afectivas. Los líderes invocan muy a menudo sus sentimientos, sus emociones, también para inducir, ¿no?, las de sus electores. Estas son palabras que se pueden leer en tu último libro. También afirmas que los populistas contemporáneos hacen de este fenómeno algo más contundente, más evidente. Entonces, ¿cómo se diferencian? ¿Cómo se puede diferenciar las emociones rutinarias, digamos, normales de un sistema político de las que actúan especialmente en los regímenes populistas?
Thank you. That's a great question. So you're absolutely right to say that, in a way, political speech always uses emotions. Aristotle called it pathos. It was the pathos, logos. He contrasted logos to pathos. And given that a politician wants to convince, a politician will often use pathos and emotions. Yet, we live in a regime of democracy, like we can call it deliberative democracy, and democracy has a different understanding of the relationship between logos and pathos, rationality and emotion. So, I think deliberative democracy makes at least three assumptions on rationality. It says that, first of all, democracy wouldn't make any sense if you did not suppose that citizens go to vote because they know their interests. I mean, if you assumed that citizens are going to vote for somebody who is against their best interest, then the idea of democracy is fairly flaky one. So this is the meaning of rationality, in which people know what they want. People know their preferences, and they act upon these preferences. This is the meaning of rationality of economists. If you didn't know your preferences, then why go to vote? It would be a very bad idea. The second sense of rationality that is really important to democracy is because you have so many ideas circulating, we allow all ideas to circulate, we hope that we will be able to distinguish right from wrong and a false idea from a good idea. So really the idea of democracy relies on epistemology, actually, on the idea that we can discover the truth and that the truth can prevail. So I would call this an epistemic rationality. Again, without it, it would make no sense to allow all ideas to circulate. And there is a third sense of rationality that is important in democracies. This is the Habermasian type of rationality from Habermas, which is that because there are so many groups in conflict with each other, because there are so many groups who have different, diverging interests, we assume that reasonable people are going to be able to arrive at a consensus. So if you think you should retire at the age of 55, and I explain to you that this will be a very heavy burden on the young people, we assume that older people will understand that they have to compromise and retire much later. So reasonableness, in a way, helps you recognize the force of the better argument that is the most advantageous for everybody. So in that sense, that's the three senses in which democracy needs rationality or needs to make an assumption of rationality. It needs rationality in a unique way. For example, monarchies do not need it in the same way at all. And the reason, so after having said this, let me say why emotions are a problem for a democracy. If you look at the works of cognitive psychologists, the most famous being Daniel Kahneman, fast thinking and slow thinking, emotions are kind of shortcuts. They are a very quick way of thinking, which make us make quite often mistakes and errors. We do not evaluate in a good way reality if we are acted upon by emotions. So emotions typically make us indifferent to calculation, to facts, to future consequences of our action, and even to our well-being. Think about the famous story of von Kleist and Michael Kohlhaas, who his horses have been stolen, and he becomes so angry that he's willing to die only to get back his two horses. And not only does he die, his wife dies, and lots of people around him dies. He doesn't care. He wants justice to be done because his anger is so overwhelming that he is willing to bring self-destruction on everyone. Or think about envy. John Rawls said it. Envy is collectively disadvantageous because the individual who envies another is prepared to do things that make both of them worse off. I would prefer to have less than what I have if that means you will have less than what you have now. So that means these are examples to show that emotions can overwhelm, if you want, the rational system of thinking that makes us preserve our self-interest and well-being. What they do, emotions focus enormously attention. That is the reason why politicians have a great interest in activating you through emotions, because let's say you're very angry at someone, you pay attention. For example, I confess to having an intense dislike to Trump, and every time he speaks, I pay really close attention because I have such a strong dislike to him. So emotions are really powerful ways of building attention, even though they make us make all these mistakes. So emotions overwhelm self-interest, they are indifferent to facts, and they, especially if these emotions become what we call moral emotions, that is, emotions about what should be, these emotions become very entrenched in our identity and selfhood. And that is the reason why also emotions make us make what I would call, using the language of psychoanalysis, projections and displacements. We can often displace the real object of our emotion onto other groups, so that, you know, it will be much easier to be angry, for example, at capitalists than to be angry at immigrants who are who are much closer to me. In fact, quite often we will be more angry at people who are close to us sociologically than people who are very far away from us. So the reason why this has become, I think, especially a topic now, is because politics has become conceived, in fact, on the mode of a consumer act. It has become extremely commodified, and it is conceived by an army of consultants, marketers, advertisers, and they promote political messages the way they promote goods, that is, by associating them with chains of emotions, with a cluster of emotions. Think about this. The number of people who support Trump is very stable. It is very stable. Why? Because it actually means their relationship to Trump is an emotional one. It means that their grievances are emotional. That is why no matter what crime he commits, no matter what outrageous things he does or says, they will not budge. That is the deleterious effect of emotions and politics.
Me pregunto si las emociones funcionan de manera similar en todo el mundo, porque usted se centra en su último libro, en el caso de Israel, que, como usted misma dice, Israel tiene problemas históricos y presentes muy singulares, tiene una geografía, un modo de llegar, mantener, acumular la tierra muy particular, pero usted considera que puede verse como paradigma de un estilo político nacionalista y populista que se ha difundido por todo el mundo. Yo me pregunto hasta qué punto considera el análisis de la situación en Israel extrapolable a otras naciones del mundo.
Oh, absolutely, except for the fact that, of course, Israel has an occupation that makes it quite different from other countries. So if you, but still, I think that Netanyahu developed a style of leadership that is actually, I wouldn't say it was the first, but I think it is paradigmatic of other populist leaders. And Professor Kim Shepely from Princeton has studied the ways in which populist leaders like Orban, Bolsonaro, Netanyahu, Trump actually imitate each other. There is a kind of internationalist, international populist. I don't know if we are aware of that. And so the textbook of, or the playbook of populists is a number of things that you find. First, they control the media. They try to reduce very much the space of what can be said. They, for example, in Israel, Sheldon Adelson, the billionaire, funded a newspaper whose main purpose was to fawn on Netanyahu and sing its praises.
Si me permitís un momento. No, este es un festival de las ideas y cada uno tiene que expresar las suyas. Pero tal vez, una vez expresadas, podíamos dejar que otras personas también se expresen. Y yo ahora os pediría, después de escucharos, que por favor, como es un festival de las ideas y hemos escuchado las vuestras, podamos también escuchar las ideas y la manera de interpretar la realidad de otras personas.
¡Es un genocidio! ¡No es una guerra! ¡Es un genocidio! ¡No es una guerra! ¡Es un genocidio! ¡No es una guerra! ¡Es un genocidio!
Si nos permitís continuar la conversación, por favor, después de haberos escuchado, sería también una manera de democratizar el diálogo. Sí, ella tiene que hablar, pero hay que dejarla hablar. Tenéis que entender eso. Si vosotras exponéis vuestras ideas por encima de las suyas, no la dejáis hablar. Es una cuestión de que ella está aquí para expresar una interpretación de la realidad que es suya, para hablar de su último trabajo, y deberíamos dejarla hacerlo, yo considero. ¿Sí?
I did not understand what you said, but you might be surprised to find out that we agree more than what you think.
A lo mejor podíais participar también escuchando lo que tenga que decir y después se puede conversar. O sea, es un festival de pensamiento. Quiero decir, esto no es una censura, no es un intento de censura, es solo que todo el mundo se pueda expresar, si lo consideráis. Bueno, vamos a continuar. Eva.
So I was explaining why Netanyahu is, I think, paradigmatic of populism. So the first is the control of the media and the narrowing of the public sphere. Orban, I think, excelled at it. And again, I think they look at each other very much. The second thing that they do is that they try to control the universities. Groups that are extreme right groups that are close to Netanyahu, for example, checked syllabi, shamed publicly teachers, and Orban, for example, closed the European University in Budapest. So they attack the intellectual, what they perceive to be the intellectual left-wing elites, and even try to make them leave. The third thing that Netanyahu did extremely well was to construct an equivalence between the outside enemy, the Arabs, with the inner enemy, which is the left. And so this transformation of the political rival, which is in democracy, this is what democracy is about. We don't agree, but we accept the disagreement. He transforms it into something that is an enmity. That is, that people from inside threaten the country from inside. And what they do also, I think the fourth element that is very much present is to appeal to a kind of nationalist rhetoric that is exclusive. And here I make a distinction between the inclusive nationalist rhetoric, for example, Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris, as you saw in her speech convention, was very much for America and praised America, but it is an America that includes everyone. These populists appeal to a past and to the version of the pure people that is not tainted either by immigrants or by, a population that is perceived as not belonging to the majority population. This is what I call an exclusionary type of nationalism. These characteristics, you find them actually absolutely everywhere, I think. They need to be modulated. And finally, I would say, maybe I will end with this, the use of fear is absolutely central to populist leaders. They will scare you with a lot of tactics. Fear is absolutely central to populist leadership. And the demonization of either minority groups or outside groups is crucial to populist leadership.
Hablaba usted del miedo, que es una de las emociones El miedo es una de las emociones que centra uno de los capítulos de este libro, además de el asco, el resentimiento, el amor. Le querría preguntar por qué estas y no otras. ¿Por qué no hay capítulos, por ejemplo, para la ira o para el odio? Porque el odio, el cultivo del odio es una emoción básicamente populista, ¿no? No es el asco, por ejemplo, una de las impresiones más básicas del odio.
So you mentioned two. You mentioned rage and you mentioned hatred. Let me talk about anger and rage, because anger is often viewed as a populist emotion. I disagree, because anger is very much present in revolutionary politics. French Revolution was full of anger. The Arab Spring was full of anger. And I don't think that emotion enables you really to distinguish between a legitimate anger of a people and an illegitimate anger, if you want. Now, to come to hatred, hatred is more difficult. I think that if you are French in 1871, after you have been defeated in the Franco-Prussian War, you are likely to hate oppression, but you don't feel disgust towards. I chose disgust and not anger and not hatred because I think disgust is the emotion of the racist, much more significantly than anything else. Disgust becomes hatred if the object of your disgust harms you. If that object of disgust, or if it is perceived as harming you, then it becomes hatred. So in hatred, you want to eliminate, to annihilate the person or the group that you hate. In disgust, it is more subtle because you want to feel superiority. You don't want necessarily to eliminate that person or that group. You just want to feel the feeling of superiority, and your disgust enables you to constantly go back on that feeling of superiority. So there are, so in the book, for example, I document the ways in which many rabbis, extremist right-wing rabbis, actually use extreme words like venom, stench, garbage, to talk about various groups: Arabs, feminists, homosexuals, leftists. They are all put in the same bag, and the meaning of that is to create disgust from these groups. That is why it is, I think, the emotion which wants to separate. It wants to say we do not want to get close to these groups. So disgust seems to me a much more characteristic emotion of the extreme right wing than the left, even though, and here I need to be careful, left people can feel disgust towards, let's say, Trumpists or Le Penists. They will rarely use a narrative of disgust. You remember that when Hillary Clinton in 2016, when she was on the campaign trail, used that very infamous phrase, a basket of deplorables. She was talking about the voters for Trump, and she said they're sexist, homophobic, racist, Islamophobic. And she called them this basket of deplorables. She had to apologize the day after. Whereas Trump does only that. The ways in which he has portrayed immigrants, for example, migrants, is as rapists, as violent murderers, and most recently we have heard, this just completely outlandish, outrageous story about Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, eating cats and dogs. The purpose of that anecdote, people were very bothered. They did not understand that anecdote. I think I understand it. What he wanted to do is create disgust from about these groups. So that kind of strategy, in my opinion, is very specific to the extreme right. It is not found among the left. And that is why I think disgust is a much more characteristic emotion of the populist right than anger is or hatred is. Because you can have, the Bolsheviks had hatred for the White Russians. They hated them. They did not have disgust for them. It was left-wing politics. So again, hatred, like anger, does not enable you to make significant differences between the two political camps and factions. I was trying to find emotions that were really characteristic of this camp.
Y de todas las emociones colectivas, se entiende que el miedo podría ser la peor porque, entre otras cosas, pues no permite distinguir entre un miedo originado por causas reales o imaginarias, esto se entiende bien leyendo este libro, hasta qué punto los miedos que tenemos son o pueden ser infundados. Se podría decir que vivimos o a veces vivimos bajo el hechizo de una alucinación colectiva.
I wouldn't say hallucination, I would say fictions. We live in fictions. Think about Benedict Anderson's marvelous thesis on imagined communities. What was his thesis? His thesis was this thing that we feel is so real that we call nationalism. He says it was actually a kind of collective fiction we created through something he calls print capitalism. The fact that people read the newspaper every day gave them the feeling that they belonged to the same community. So fictions doesn't mean it doesn't have real powerful effect. We know how devastatingly powerful nationalism is. So fictions are very much, I think, a part of our collective life. And that is one of the reasons why emotions are so important to understand this process. Because emotions enable you to continue writing the story. So let me give you another example. Israel, for example, has enemies outside its frontiers. Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, Iran. These are enemies, let's say. They are real enemies. They have declared themselves as enemies. But when you connect that to the story of the Holocaust, you create now a new narrative of fear. And the fear becomes different. It becomes a fear that is eternal. it becomes a fear where you telescope geopolitical and military conflict into something that takes a quasi-metaphysical dimension. It's not the same fear. It becomes something else. This is where you connect reality in a way and fiction. Not that the Holocaust was fiction, of course, but in the sense that it doesn't belong. It's another story. You telescope two stories together and you create a new story. That is how emotions are, I think, always work. They feed into this imaginary dimension or imaginary way in which we interpret our social world, because the emotion keep the story going and they make us write the continuation of the story. Did you ask about fear? I'm sorry, I forgot.
No, sobre el miedo antes. Ahora voy a seguir con la siguiente pregunta, porque además vamos un poco justas de tiempo, Eva, así que voy a avanzar con la siguiente pregunta, porque estabas hablando de la situación de Israel, entonces vamos a seguir hablando de ello. Precisamente por esa situación de Israel que tú citabas, entre la ciudadanía israelí, se ha convertido la seguridad en un rasgo mental clave en los ciudadanos, como tú afirmas. Se convierte de este modo en una democracia securitista, además guiada por un líder populista. Tú eres muy dura con Netanyahu y con su gobierno. Me pregunto si esto se podía evitar, ese rasgo mental clave en los ciudadanos, que es que la seguridad esté por encima de todo. Me pregunto si esto se podría evitar, si hay defensa posible a nivel individual o social ante ese miedo.
So, I think Machiavelli really understood very well that fear is the prime political emotion. And fear is the emotion of tyrants, in a way, whether you live in a formal tyranny or not. Fear controls the political arena. I mean, think about what happened during the COVID pandemic. 5 billion people were immobilized. They stopped their work, they stopped going out, they stopped socializing. And so the fear of the virus managed to do what the most brutal tyrant would have never been able to do, which is to keep people at home immobilized. So fear is an extremely powerful ingredient of social life. That is the reason why, for example, the extreme right, Eric Zemmour, when 3 years ago there was a gruesome murder of a young adolescent by an illegal immigrant, and he called it a francocide. He wanted to imitate the word genocide, and he says, these immigrants are about to do a francocide. And of course, if you use that word, the only feeling you can feel is fear. So that is a very powerful way to control what people will do. And that is the reason why law and order politics always privileges fear. Now, I would say there are two schools about your question, how to combat emotions. One school is the rationalist school. Stoicism is a part of it. In other words, the idea is to combat your false emotion, to understand that the emotion you're feeling is wrong. No immigrant is going to erase the French people, come on. And to eliminate the other, and to eliminate the emotion like this. I don't believe in that school. There is another school which says you fight an emotion with another emotion. Albert Hirschman is in his wonderful book called The Passions and the Interests, explains the development of this idea of how emotions are supposed to fight bad emotions. And so that is the reason why I think, Barack Obama's 1984 Hope speech, and then it became a book, The Audacity of Hope, was a very powerful intervention in the political sphere because it combated the right wing in front of him with the emotion of hope, which is, by the way, thought to be an emotion of the left. Typically, it's the Enlightenment emotion. Or if you look at Kamala Harris now, it is quite interesting, in my opinion, that she's emphasizing joy precisely as a way to combat the sinister, morbid, sad passions, as Spinoza would say, of Trump, with what the American press has called the vibes campaign. The vibes campaign is precisely to counter a bad emotion with a good emotion. So I would add, after having said this, I'm going to contradict myself, I will contradict myself and say that the political arena never can wipe out fear, and that the difference that you have between the left and the right often is a different way to prioritize different fears. So after 9/11, everybody thought that terrorism was the first thing you should be afraid of. This is what brought America into disastrous wars. And others, still today, think that gun ownership is the thing that you should be most scared of. So the question in the political arena is not to actually erase fear. It is often to prioritize and hierarchize fears differently. It is to oppose one fear to another fear.
Y si Netanyahu, como otros líderes populistas, son líderes amados a través de un miedo, ese miedo que explicaba Eva que se instala en la psique colectiva, ¿qué posibilidad hay de desbancarlos algún día del poder?
I would love to know. I mean, seriously, Mr. Security proved to be the most total disaster on Israel's security ever, which is really, I think, Netanyahu is a marvelous example of the ways in which those leaders who constantly nourish fear and speak about security actually never bring true security, because true security comes, in my opinion, from a genuine social contract between citizens, all citizens, and the state. It comes from diplomacy. It comes from respecting human rights inside a country. But we do not have, I think, a very elaborate civilian language of security. It seems as if the only language that now is used to speak about security is the military language, when in fact civilian means to achieve security, like I said, diplomacy, human rights, social contract between the state, a full social contract between the state and citizens, is a much stronger way to achieve real security in a given state. So, but again, the military has conquered the ways in which we think about security. After Iran attacked Israel with drones or missiles on April 13th, believe it or not, this disastrous leader who would never be re-elected actually saw his approval ratings shot up again, because we were back to the military way of thinking, and because we were back to this idea that only the military can achieve security.
Y tanto el miedo como el asco, porque usted habla también de ese asco inventado, atañe tan solo a esa parte del espectro político de la que habla usted de la derecha israelí, o el conjunto de la política. Podemos decir que el conjunto de la política está repleta de ese mecanismo de deshumanización.
I have to say that I don't think so. At least, to go back to example I used before of Hillary Clinton just using an unfortunate phrase of basket of deplorables. She was criticized even by her own camp. And the reason why, I think, is because it has become very difficult, if not impossible, among liberals or in the left to express disgust towards other human groups. This is something that the right does, the extreme right, does much more willingly, and actually it is almost constitutive of the ways in which the extreme right thinks of itself. It thinks constantly in terms of us and them. So we have on the one hand, a political camp which, in its best versions, try to be inclusive of all humanity and of all social groups. And we have, and this is what the left I believe in, the utopian left was a project to precisely emancipate all human beings. While the extreme right always falls down on hierarchies of human beings. And that is a fundamental difference between them. So I don't think, again, in the public discourse, I do not think you would find the same uses of the emotion of disgust in the liberal left-wing camp. You could find, as I said, privately expressions of disgust from Trumpists, about Trumpists or Le Penists, or people from the AfD, but I don't think you could build really a narrative around disgust from these people.
Otra de las ideas, una de las más fascinantes del libro, a mi modo de ver, es la manera en la que se persigue y se utiliza el estatus de víctima, que a su vez permite obrar bajo esa égida del resentimiento, esa otra emoción que usted trata. Considera, como Wendy Brown, que nos acompaña también hoy, que el resentimiento puede considerarse como una herramienta de unión, ¿no? Como el modo que los resentidos se unen en torno a una herida, que le pregunto si también puede ser imaginaria.
So, for me, resentment is a kind of envy. And envy has very much preoccupied political philosophers. And I view an opposition between Alexis de Tocqueville. For Tocqueville, equality, democracy, will bring envy. Because if you expect to be the equal of someone else, then why would you have more than me? So democracy brings envy. For Nietzsche, I want to say it's the other way around. Nietzsche says, no, I envy, and I disguise and hide my envy behind a so-called moral claim to equality. I want equality just because I don't want you to have what you have. Now, I have to say that I think that Nietzsche is wrong on something important, and which is that resentment has powerful equalitarian demands. In other words, what I'm saying is that, for me, it is normal to envy your colleague or your neighbor because you work as hard as they do, for example, maybe even harder, and you get much, much less. Envy, for me, is not condemnable at all. What the problem with resentment is that it scapegoats. That is, it makes a displacement. What I mean by that is that it often targets the wrong groups. You are not well off, somebody else is well off, so you will be angry at the person who is well off or the groups who are well off, and you will not actually think of other groups or other processes that are responsible for this disparity of conditions. So, for example, in Germany in the 1920s, Jews were a very small, tiny minority in Germany and in Austria, but they were very visible in professions like law and medicine. And they came to be viewed, and it was also a huge economic crisis. And so what happened is that there was an amalgam, a mixture. You attributed to them, because you resented their success, you attributed to them the fact that you were less well off. That is the problem of resentment, in my opinion. It is the fact that it does a displacement, and it chooses quite often the wrong object. Yeah.
Señala además que el papel de víctima y de victimario se pueden llegar a intercambiar. Usted señala el ejemplo del propio Trump, ya lo ha citado en esta conversación, pero que se presenta ante los suyos como víctima de unas élites, como si él mismo no fuese élite. Y bueno, y su gente lo cree así. ¿Cómo podemos distinguir entonces a las víctimas de verdad de las que no lo son, a las genuinas de las falsas víctimas?
So I think here you point to a very important question, because in fact I think what we call victimhood culture has given a lot of incentives to everybody presenting themselves as victims, including the elites. So Trump and Netanyahu, believe it or not, who are bona fide members of the elites. Actually, Netanyahu is superb at doing this. He presents himself all the time as the underdog of the left-wing elites. That's what he does. He's excellent at that. I think, if there is something that other leaders imitated from him, it is that. Because he's one of the first to have talked about a deep state and made himself a victim of the deep state. But it's not only them. It's all kinds of very famous people. Britney Spears, for example, who owns hundreds of millions of dollars, has told us in unsparing detail her childhood, where she had an alcoholic father and a mother who had a very abundant hemorrhage, I think you say, after she gave birth. So in this way, she wants to gain the status of a victim, and it becomes very confusing. This is the reason why underprivileged people identify with highly privileged people who present themselves as victims. So I would give a very simple answer to your question, how do we make a difference? I think genuine victims are those whose life course has been disrupted in some way. Imaginary victims are those who use it to score point, to gain power, to gain status, and to gain attention. You can tell the difference.
Eva, estamos fuera de tiempo, es verdad que hemos empezado más tarde, pero los compañeros de la siguiente conversación están empezando. ¿Qué te parece si vamos a por las dos últimas preguntas? Saltamos a una que teníamos sin verdad y vamos a concretar un buen final. Yo quería hablar contigo, quería que hablase sobre lo que ha ocurrido por primera vez desde la reunificación alemana. Dos estados del este han votado alternativa como alternativa por Alemania como primera opción. Es el caso de Turingia y como segunda opción en el caso de Sajonia. Usted habla de impulsos populistas antidemocráticos, lo que podemos llamar tendencias fascistas. No fascismo, tendencias fascistas. ¿Cuánto nos separa todavía de ese fascismo victorioso que tan desgraciadamente hemos conocido en Europa?
So, critical theory that I read and I am inspired of people like Adorno, Horkheimer, Hannah Arendt even, but especially Adorno and Horkheimer, I think, had this view that fascism, even though it had officially collapsed, was actually still at work in capitalist societies, because the conditions for fascism still existed. And for Adorno, the main culprit for this is what he called the continuous accumulation of capital. And I think, so it means for him, that's very interesting, that fascism is not an accident of history. It is not an aberration. It is a shadow, if you want. It is the shadow that accompanies capitalist democracies. And that is one of the main themes of critical theory. That is, the ways in which under heavy capitalism, we constantly are on the verge of recreating the conditions for fascism. So we should look at the social pathologies of democracy and capitalism as a preamble of fascism. How? I'm not going to give an analysis, but think, for example, of the enormous amount of money that is invested in so-called democratic politics. In America, Republicans and Democrats are actually financed by billionaires, and none of them really threatens at all the structure in which they take place. They agree, in fact, in keeping rather intact the structure itself. In fact, Clinton, who is a Democrat, brought catastrophic consequences in enabling first the globalization and with the NAFTA agreement. So that's one way in which you can say money, accumulation of capital, really distorts and corrupts from inside democracy. You can also say that it controls the public sphere. And we see this in many places, more and more, in fact. You have Bolloré in France, who controls more and more media. You have Murdoch, who controls, again, more and more media in America and Australia. So this control of the public space facilitates, if you want, paves the road for other ideas, and it vitiates democracy from inside. And finally, maybe we can think that, this capitalism has grown to enormous proportion. It has become really monopolistic. It has enabled the accumulation of wealth never before seen. And it actually really disempowers. We feel far less able to fight whoever there is to fight. I mean, the French Revolution was a children's game. There was a king, and this is the one you wanted to take out. If you want to take out today whatever exists, you have no idea where to go. So there is a very strong sense of fragmentation of power at the same time that this power has enormously increased, which creates in return a very strong disempowerment and the sense that the institutions no longer represent us. This is one of the main sources of populism, the sense that institutions do not represent ordinary citizens. And in a way, they're right. The people who feel that the institutions do not represent them are right. They do not represent them, because it is vitiated again by what Adorno and Horkheimer thought was the danger that the accumulation of capital would represent for democracy.
Y esta es nuestra última pregunta, Eva. Hemos hablado de emociones que son totalmente enemigas de la democracia, pero claro, tenemos que hablar también de cuáles no, o utilizando tus palabras, ¿qué emociones deberían estar presentes en una sociedad decente?
Well, the one I would choose above all others is the one that appears in the French motto. The French motto is liberté, égalité, fraternité. Fraternité being brotherhood. I'm sorry, I don't have a less sexist word to say it, because sisterhood is different. Brotherhood means the capacity to defend justice for human beings who do not belong to my group. In that sense, it is very different from solidarity. And I really want to, many people speak about solidarity and say, oh, we are not solidary anymore. I don't think solidarity, I don't make such a big deal out of solidarity. Israel, for example, is very high on solidarity, and it is very low on fraternity. It is very low on fraternity because, most people, if you ask most people in Israel, a good majority, especially among the young people, are willing to give much less rights to Arabs than to Jews.
Estado sionista, Estado terrorista, Estado sionista, Estado terrorista, Estado sionista, Estado terrorista, Estado sionista.
Estábamos terminando la conversación, apenas quedaba una respuesta. Yo creo que las personas que están aquí sentadas también merecen escuchar lo que estaba acabando de decir Eva Illouz. Bueno, tan solo un minuto, por favor. De verdad, gracias por expresaros, pero estaría bien también que dejaseis que se expresen otras personas, entre ellas quien está aquí sentada y a quien han venido a escuchar, quienes nos acompañan. Entonces, todo se puede conjugar, todo se puede conjugar. No hay por qué impedir la expresión para expresarse. En todo caso, gracias por quedaros hasta el final, eso sí. Eva, ¿has perdido el hilo o quieres que te pregunte de nuevo? Estábamos hablando de las emociones que tú consideras que debe tener una sociedad.
I have just a very last thing I want to say. So, fraternity for me is a human bond with a stranger. That is why it is different from solidarity, which is about my group. And I don't think this is how you build a democracy. I think building a democracy is by building relationships of justice with strangers, precisely with people who are not from my group. And I have to say that I was very moved I was trying to think of, an example. There are many examples of fraternity, but in 2019, the Pope Francis and the Grand Imam Ahmed Mohammed Al-Tayeb signed a very beautiful document that said something like they held both the firm conviction that authentic teachings of religions invite us to remain rooted in the values of peace, to defend mutual understanding and human fraternity. And that, for me, is the only really possible way to have democratic relationships today inside a decent society, as you said it.
Muchas gracias, Eva Illouz, por compartir con nosotros tu manera de interpretar la realidad. Gracias a todos los que seguís ahí, a todos. Enseguida llegan Wendy Brown y José Luis García Calero. Muchas gracias, hasta la próxima.